I want to welcome everyone to a panel that addresses the key issue of the day, supply chain disruptions with the labor shortages that we have seen and some of the dynamics of a market still trying to turn back on after the pandemic. There is nobody better to speak about this than our next panelist, Robert Sanchez, who is the chairman and chief executive officer of Ryder. It is a company with 40,000 employees and really handles this key issue, which is how do we get stuff from one place to another? How do we connect the dots in a world that relies increasingly on just-in-time delivery and the transportation of goods? Robert, I want to just get started with the idea of these supply chain disruptions that we have continued to see and how you have observed them from your unique and frankly highly privileged perspective of being at the heart of it.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you. Thanks for having me. Look, Ryders, as you mentioned, we're involved in supply chain activity. We're involved in just about every industry supply chain in North America in one way or another. So we do everything from leasing and renting a fleet of trucks to actually running private fleets for companies that are doing deliveries. We have 250,000 vehicles that we provide to customers. We employ about 10,000 commercial truck drivers. We also run big distribution centers for companies. We've got about 300 distribution centers that we run with about 14,000 warehouse workers that work in those facilities. And more recently, we also offer final mile delivery of big and bulky products. So we really touch a lot of different parts of what's going on. And clearly what we've seen over the last 18 to 20 months is really unprecedented. If you think about global supply chains for different industries, they're really like an orchestra. And it's an orchestra that's playing a symphony. And that symphony has been refined over many years. So if you take the retail industry, for example, you've got suppliers in Asia. You've got shipping companies that bring those supplies across to North America. You've got ports that then, through trucking companies, deliver them to distribution centers for retailers who ultimately deliver them to the retail store and more direct to consumers' homes. So this thing has been running for a long time. The players know their part. There's a lot of planning that goes into these supply chains. And there's a movement of goods, there's a movement of information, and there's a movement of funds that happens as a normal course of business. And everybody knows their part and kind of works well. The orchestra works well together. But if you think about what happened last year, the music stopped. And all of a sudden you had, folks in the orchestra that needed to go do something different because they didn't have the job they had before. So you think about in the auto sector, where auto production shut down for 6 months. I'm sorry, for 6 weeks, not 6 months, 6 weeks. It was unprecedented. It had never happened before. So you saw semiconductor companies that were providing semiconductors to the auto companies. They pivoted and they started providing semiconductors to consumer electronics. And as we were all moving in to our homes and buying new computers to be able to work from home, there was a spike in demand for that. You remember the rush for hand sanitizers and masks. All of that kind of shifted, and you had even people that were in the supply chain, think about food and beverage business, had to shift away from restaurants and more to people eating at home. So if you think about back to that orchestra analogy, there was a big shift in the music that was being played, and the orchestra, the band kind of moved around.
Well, right now, what we're hearing, just before you go on, hold on one second, because this is sort of how we got to where we are, right? The idea that this nuanced orchestra, as you put it, that took decades to develop, got shut down, and now it's going to take time to come back on. Where are we in the restarting process? How much longer do we have?
Yeah, look, this thing doesn't get fixed overnight. In the supply chain business, we deal with disruption all the time. You have natural disasters. Think about hurricanes, earthquakes. You have traffic. You have weather situations. So supply chains have to respond when these things happen. It's typically when there's a bottleneck somewhere. The way you solve these things is you have to throw resources at it. You got to throw people at it. You have to throw more resources at the situation. You have to synchronize across the supply chain. So if there's opportunities to divert a good somewhere differently to alleviate the problem, you need to do that. And then you need some time. And that is kind of what we're in right now. So this does not get fixed overnight. It does probably get worse before it gets better. I think what we need here is continued synchronization among the players and additional resources, as you heard last week, there was talk about opening up third shifts. Those are absolutely things we need to do to expand the capacity, certainly at the port level. And then the rest of the supply chain, which is a lot of what we're doing, the rest of the supply chain needs to continue to operate so that once that bottleneck gets resolved, there's not another bottleneck that shows up somewhere else. So, yeah, unfortunately, this thing is going to be around certainly through the end of the year. It's going to probably get a little bit worse before it gets better. But the important thing is that we take the steps to provide the right resources that we need to get through this.
When you say throw resources at it, I think paycheck. I think how much is compensation going up, especially as we hear about all of the shortages of drivers, particularly truck drivers out there in order to get things around. How much are you seeing wages going up, and have they gone up enough to actually sate the demand for drivers?
Yeah, wages are going up, but we do have a more systemic problem with the driver shortage. And you know, the driver shortage is, you're hearing a lot about it now, but in the industry, we've been dealing with this driver shortage for at least the last decade, and it has clearly escalated over the last 18 months. It is a problem because of the demographics of folks. There's more people. We have an older population in the driver workforce. We have a move away from driving as a profession by younger people that has also impacted us. So a lot of it is now how do we expand the pool for drivers long term? The short term, there isn't an easy fix. I mean, the government can do several things, I think, in the short term to alleviate it. In some cases, maybe expanding the number of hours that a driver can drive, especially as we're trying to get stuff out of these ports. Also, I think helping to expand the pool of young people that want to become drivers. One of the challenges with commercial truck drivers today is that you can't be a driver crossing state lines with a commercial vehicle unless you're 21 years old. So somebody coming out of high school that wants to go into the trades probably can't choose commercial truck driver because they can't take on the full responsibility of driver till they're 21. So lowering that age to 18 with the right safety requirements, I think, is a big opportunity for us. And the other thing I would tell you is immigration. You know, that we need about 60,000 additional commercial drivers in the U.S. today. Over the next 10 years, we have to hire over 1 million truck drivers to offset the retirements that we're seeing. You're going to need a lot of help in order to do that. I think it's going to require more people coming in, young people coming in. It's going to require some work from immigration as qualified drivers from other countries can come to the U.S. to take some of these unfilled jobs. And then expanding the pool, bringing more women into the to the professional driver workforce. These are jobs that pay on average $60,000 to $65,000 a year. You can make over $100,000 a year as a professional driver, so they are well-paying jobs. As you mentioned, there has been an increase in pay and wage inflation, which I think some of that is helpful in attracting more people. But wage inflation alone isn't going to solve the problem.
What about on the flip side? And this has been one thesis that people have, that the longer these labor shortages go on, the more people look to technological solutions. And I'm thinking about Tesla and the self-driving truck. How much is that a realistic solution from your vantage point?
Yeah, Ryders, we're very involved in that. We've partnered with numerous companies that are in the autonomous truck space. I do think that will become a reality. When? You know, it could be in the next 5 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. And in certain lanes, I would tell you, too, certain functions. So on highway from one ramp to another is more likely. It's a simpler autonomous solution, if you will. So I do think autonomy will be part of the long-term solution. But there's still going to be plenty of jobs needed to be filled for doing final mile deliveries of those products. And even in areas where autonomy may not work, you know, probably more likely to happen in the South where you don't have as many weather conditions as you do up in the North. So it's going to have to be a combination of all those things, of which technology will be part of it.
In the meantime, something that you said before that I want to dig a little further into, this idea that you think that the supply chain disruptions will get worse before they get better. Can you give us a sense of what worse looks like? Is it just more expensive, or is it just much longer delays and empty shelves for a longer period of time?
Yeah, I think it could be a little bit of both, right? Certainly longer delays and empty shelves, especially as we get now into the holiday season, as we try to break these log jams, and also suppliers begin to ramp up on the things, on those critical items that we're in need. So it is a combination of both of those. I think going into the holiday season, this is going to be a very different holiday season in terms of we're used to having plenty of supply of the things that we want. I think this year is going to be a little different. But the good news is this is transitory. We will get through this, whether it takes us, 1 quarter or 2 quarters or 3 quarters. The truth is these issues do get resolved. There's a lot of incentive for all the players in the supply chain to get this right. So I'm confident that, we'll work together to get that done.
On the other side of this, how different does the supply chain look?
Well, I think you're going to have a few things different. I think, there's a lot of lessons learned here. So I do think you're going to see supply chains get shorter. So, maybe more manufacturing brought closer to the point of consumption, because that gives you a lot more ability to react quickly. So more onshoring and nearshoring of manufacturing, I think, will be an outcome of this. There was a bit of a trend already happening, but I think this could accelerate that trend. I think certainly you're going to see more inventorying of parts. I mean, we have situations today where automobiles that cost $60,000, $70,000 are on the sidelines because of a semiconductor that might cost $1. So inventorying those semiconductors or those components that have the semiconductors, as opposed to having ultra lean supply chains, I think is going to be a movement that we'll see coming out of this as companies become more sensitive to, what the impact of a shortfall of a product that they had historically viewed as always available is going to be.
What did you think of President Biden's speech when he talked about some of the supply chain issues and how he plans to remedy them? You spoke about keeping ports open longer so that would be helpful. What didn't you hear from him that you wanted to?
Well, look, I think I applaud him for the coordination effort. Unfortunately, these things require a lot of speed to get. You want to get them done very quickly, and the government historically is not the fastest moving enterprise. But I do think that the coordination between the port authorities, the labor, trucking companies is certainly welcomed, and we need more of that. I think also they should look at relaxation of certain rules that may be keeping drivers from driving longer, maybe keeping certain types of vehicles out of the ports in California because of emissions that can help to speed that up. I think longer term, it's really the issues around. I'd love to hear them talk about how they can help us resolve the driver shortage issue longer term with, as I mentioned, adjusting the age for when young people can become commercial truck drivers. Smart immigration reform could really help the situation, and really focusing on those types of legislative changes that I think can help us. Also, anything that helps nearshoring and onshoring of manufacturing type activity, I think ultimately can help prepare the supply chains for what this is going to look like when we get to the other side.
It's not just a logistics perspective here. It's also a question as we go into COP26 of the emissions footprint, as you talk about ferrying around a lot of goods with diesel-fueled trucks. How are you adjusting to emission standards and sort of retrofitting certain types of either warehouses or trucks with devices that can potentially reduce the footprint?
Yeah, look, the whole purpose of our job is to refine the supply chain and make it as efficient as possible. So just by its nature, we're reducing emissions. But clearly, technology changes that are underway around electric trucks, electric warehouse management equipment. We're in the forefront of that, too, working with some of both the traditional truck manufacturers and some of the startups on helping to introduce those to the marketplace. I think we're still some years away from getting that becoming a reality. Light duty delivery vans, we see that as probably the first class of vehicles where you're going to see electrification. But there's still a lot of work to be done there. We're working very closely with these organizations and helping to introduce them into the marketplace. So we're excited about it because we think it really presents a great opportunity for us to, lead the change, if you will, as that technology evolves and really becomes valuable for our customers.
I just find it amazing that we're dealing with all of these log jams at a time of profound transformation. And we're seeing this highlighted probably best in the oil industry, given how much prices have surged simply because there has been an underinvestment in plants that are deemed as old-fashioned or, out of line with respect to emission standards. So we're dealing with these rising costs at a time when we also are dealing with the higher costs of disruption from labor shortages and the idea of just where things are coming from and COVID. From your perspective, how much more on average are costs for people to ship things now than in the past? And I say this because I wonder whether the consumer is prepared to pay for that.
Yeah, it really depends on what you're moving. But when you look at freight cost and spot freight costs that have gone up in the last year, 25% in some areas, 30%, that's a meaningful increase in the cost of shipping. And companies do different things to try to offset that. They run their own vehicles if they can. They look for alternatives. They outsource to companies like Ryder. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing is when all this disruption is really creating a big opportunity for companies like Ryder, that this is what we do for a living. So we're going to have record sales this year as companies have all said, hey, I'm having a tough time. Let me go find somebody that can help me. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to help companies figure out how do I mitigate? Like we can't eliminate some of these market cost increases, but certainly helping to mitigate those costs. But I think what you mentioned about fuel costs, I think, is an important data point, because we all want to move to lower emissions, greener technology, but ultimately there has to be an economic value proposition for businesses. Because what we've learned, and over the years we have, provided natural gas trucks to our customers, hybrid trucks, and what we've learned through that process is that everybody wants to move to the, zero emissions, but they're not going to do it unless it provides economic benefit to them. And that's where the technology needs to get to. And I think that's the piece that still requires some time, is how do I get the battery costs down? How do I get the infrastructure so that these greener technologies really don't provide inflation and provide harm to the economy as opposed to helping?
When do you think that we'll actually be at a place where we do see that economic dynamic spurring people toward more greener types of energy?
Yeah, on the commercial truck side, I think right now the closest is the light duty delivery van. So you think the delivery vans are delivering, e-commerce packages to your house. Some of those could be, they're getting pretty close. They could be there in the next year or two. The larger medium duty trucks and the larger tractor trailers that you see, those are still quite a ways away. The cost is still significantly more for the vehicle, even when you take into consideration the savings on fuel costs. So that is, I think, much further out, probably more, it could be up to a decade away.
As we talk about supply chains, I have to wonder China's role in this, given some of the harsher lockdowns and given the fact that in many ways they have been a factory to the world. How much can people really diversify away from China, given their presence in this entire ecosystem?
Yeah, it can't happen overnight. And certainly some of this started with the tariffs that we saw a few years ago that started to really create, had companies begin to look at this issue. And I think the tightening, if you will, around the economy that we're seeing in China, I think is making companies think twice about continued investments or the investment of the next plant, whether they're going to be there or try to be here closer to the U.S. where the consumption happens. So I think you're going to see over time, it doesn't happen overnight, but you're going to see more of the newer investments start to happen on a North American basis, whether it's U.S., Mexico, or Canada, and less on the Asia side. Again, it's a combination of what's happening from a geopolitical standpoint, but also an outcome of this pandemic and the need to really respond quickly to what's happening in the supply chain. You can do that better if your supply chain is shorter.
Well, how realistic is that? Because this is something I've heard conflicting points on. Some people say, yeah, you're going to see more onshoring and more localized factories. And other people saying, Well, really, it's very difficult to do that, not only from an expense standpoint, but from an expertise standpoint, and that people are still going to China. And, Vietnam is sort of the popular offshoot to China for some of these production needs, and it remains so and hasn't really gone down that much. Is that the truth, or have supply chains shifted much more away than people realize?
Well, you could have supply chains that are shifting within China, right? I mean, within Asia, that are going to China, as you mentioned, to Vietnam and Thailand. You are seeing some of that, but you are also seeing supply chains now that are moving closer to the U.S. and more towards North America. There is a labor training issue that needs to be addressed. There's a broader labor issue beyond truck drivers, just manufacturing expertise. And that's something I think the government can help with also, around training programs to be able to ramp up the workforce in the U.S. and in North America to be able to take on some of these jobs. But it can happen. Just like the jobs went away many years ago, they certainly can come back. And I don't think it's not going to be an all or nothing, but certainly incrementally moving more towards North America, I think, is a high likelihood of happening.
We just have a couple minutes left, and I do think about the just-in-time delivery system, and we have to really touch on this transformation in the economy where people expect to press a button and then get it on the doorstep within the next hour. I wonder what you see as Amazon's role in the delivery mechanisms, in logistics going forward, given how much they've transformed our idea of how we get goods and when we get them.
Yeah, clearly they're going to continue to be a big player. I mean, they are the big player in e-commerce, but as with any great business and industry, you're going to see new players pop up. You're going to see more companies move into that final mile delivery space. I mentioned that we are already in that space for the stuff that your typical parcel company doesn't move. So you think about furniture, fitness equipment, and appliances. Ryder moves those today to people's homes. We're also looking to get into that final mile e-fulfillment of broader type products that are smaller and really competing with some of these companies and helping our customers compete with them. So we're excited about that. That takes a while to ramp up, and that's what we're in the process of doing. But it's gonna become a competitive landscape as what typically happens. But clearly, I see Amazon continuing to be a big player, if not the big player in the space.
Have you found that it's increasingly difficult to hire competitively?
Well, that's one of the benefits I think Ryder has is for the jobs that we provide. Think about, we talked about truck drivers, warehouse workers, diesel technicians. We have a very extensive driver recruiting network. As you said, we've got over 40,000 employees. So we view it as an advantage for us in a difficult hiring environment. We're typically able to find and hire qualified truck drivers where companies on their own may have a challenge doing that. Same thing with technicians and warehouse workers. So we view it, yes, it's an ongoing challenge. I think it'll continue to be, but I think it's also an opportunity for Ryder to help other companies that may not have this capability.
Have you been interested in making any acquisitions? And I ask from the vantage point of a lot of M&A that's been out there, and the fact that having this scale is all the more important in a position of your type.
Sure. No, we're certainly actively looking at acquisition opportunities, especially around the supply chain and logistics space. We view over time really that portion of the business of the company becoming a larger percentage of the overall Ryder story. So where we can acquire not just new customers, but where we can acquire new capabilities in the supply chain space. You think about, as I mentioned, the e-fulfillment, where you're more doing that final mile delivery of parcels. We're looking at that as an opportunity. New industries, we're heavy in automotive and industrial and retail and consumer packaged goods, but other industries that we can serve, we want to get into. So yes, we are actively looking at M&A and as a way of helping to bolster the growth of the company.